The sound of an arrow splitting air was all the warning they had. One moment the Wilson family wagon was creaking along the narrow mountain pass, the next, chaos. Blood-curdling screams echoed through Shadowpine Forest as bandits descended upon the travelers like wolves. When silence finally returned to the ancient pines, only Emma remained, trembling beneath the overturned wagon, the smell of gunpowder and death all around her. How long could a city-bred woman with no survival skills last in these unforgiving mountains? And what would happen when Thomas Rivers, the legendary Cherokee tracker hired to hunt the bandits, discovered her makeshift camp instead? Sometimes survival means trusting the very person you've been taught to fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Wilson's ears rang with echoes of screams long silenced. The forest around her, once merely scenery glimpsed from the relative safety of their wagon, now loomed like prison walls. 3 days had passed since the attack on Settlers Pass. 3 days since she'd crawled from beneath the blood-spattered canvas that had hidden her from the bandits' eyes. The afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of Shadowpine Forest, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Emma stared at her hands, raw and blistered from her desperate attempts to bury her family. The fresh mounds of earth behind her makeshift camp were the only markers of where her old life had ended, where mother, father, and younger brother now rested beneath the indifferent Carolina soil. Just until we reached Riverton, her father had promised back in Charleston, his eyes bright with visions of opportunity. A trading post now, but soon to be the jewel of western North Carolina. Robert Wilson had always been a dreamer, seeing prosperity where others saw only wilderness. Martha, her mother, had been more practical, packing extra medicines and tools, while Robert filled Daniel's head with tales of adventure. None of them had expected the mountain pass to become their final destination. Emma shivered despite the warm June air. Her thin cotton dress, once a respectable pale blue, now hung in tatters around her ankles. Stained with mud and darker spots she refused to examine too closely. The small fire she'd managed to start after countless failed attempts flickered, weakly more smoke than flame. She'd never been taught such things. Starting fires, finding food, surviving. Those were men's concerns, her mother had always said. Ladies learned embroidery and household management, not how to skin rabbits or read forest trails. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Emma froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bandits had seemed confident they'd left no survivors. But what if they returned? Or worse, what if the forest held other predators, four-legged or otherwise? She reached for the small kitchen knife she'd salvaged from the wagon, its blade pathetically dull but better than bare hands. "Please," she whispered, though to whom she wasn't certain. God seemed far away from this green hell, and her prayers had gone unanswered for 3 days now. The crack had come from eastward, downhill toward the stream where she'd collected water earlier that morning. She held her breath, straining to hear over the pounding of her pulse in her ears. Nothing, just the whisper of pine needles overhead and the occasional call of a bird. Emma exhaled slowly, her fingers unclenching from around the knife handle. Imagination, she told herself, nerves frayed to breaking. She couldn't sustain this level of terror indefinitely. Either it would drive her mad, or she would need to master it. Neither option seemed particularly achievable. Her stomach cramped painfully, a reminder of more immediate concerns. The dried beef and hardtack from their travel provisions had lasted 2 days. Since then, she'd managed to find some berries that resembled the blackberries that grew in her aunt's garden back in Charleston, but she'd been too afraid to eat anything else. Plants that looked familiar might be poisonous cousins to those she knew. Animals required hunting and cleaning, skills as foreign to her as speaking Chinese. Emma forced herself to her feet, ignoring the protest of muscles unused to physical labor. The stream was her lifeline. Clean water at least kept the worst of hunger at bay. She took the small tin cup from beside the fire and made her way downhill, moving as quietly as her untrained feet would allow. Each step through the underbrush sounded to her like drums, announcing her presence. But she persisted, drawn by thirst and the need to wash the grime from her face and hands. The stream cut through the forest like a silver ribbon, its cheerful gurgling at odds with the desperation Emma felt. She knelt at the water's edge, plunging her hands into the icy flow. The cold shocked her senses, grounding her in the moment. She drank deeply, then refilled the cup for later. As she straightened, something on the opposite bank caught her eye. A perfect impression in the soft mud. A footprint, human, too large to be her own. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but some deeper wisdom held her in place. Running created noise, betrayed position. Instead, Emma slowly backed away from the water's edge, retreating into the shadow of a large oak. Her eyes scanned the opposite bank, searching for movement, for anything out of place. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her. Even the birds had gone silent. That, more than anything, sent ice through her veins. In 3 days, she'd learned that much at least. When the forest fell silent, something was moving through it. She wasn't alone. The realization nearly buckled her knees. Emma pressed back against the oak's rough bark, willing herself to become part of it, invisible to whoever shared these woods with her. Minutes stretched like hours as she waited, barely breathing. A figure emerged from the trees, across the stream, moving with such fluid silence that Emma might have missed it entirely had she not been watching so intently. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a mixture of settlers' clothing and what looked like native garments. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that spoke of mixed heritage, high cheekbones and copper skin suggesting Cherokee blood, but other features that hinted at European ancestry as well. He moved like water over stone, each step deliberate and soundless. In one hand, he carried a hunting knife. The other held what appeared to be a rolled hide or blanket slung over his shoulder. The man knelt beside the footprint Emma had noticed, his fingers hovering over it without touching. His head tilted, reading something in the impression that would have been invisible to her eyes. Then he looked up directly at the oak where Emma hid. She didn't breathe, didn't blink, prayed that the shadows concealed her as effectively as she'd hoped. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. He spoke, his voice surprisingly soft for someone of his size. "I know you're there. I mean no harm." Emma remained frozen. Trust had died with her family on the mountain pass. The man sighed, sheathing his knife in a gesture she supposed was meant to appear non-threatening. "You left tracks all through these woods. Might as well have painted arrows pointing to your camp." He switched to sitting cross-legged beside the stream, hands resting open on his knees. "I'm not one of the men who attacked your wagon." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. He knew about the attack. Had he been watching her all this time, following her? "My name is Thomas Rivers," he continued when she didn't respond. "Some call me Hawkeye. I was hired in Riverton to track the men who've been raiding along Settlers Pass." He gestured toward the distant mountains. "Found your wagon yesterday. Saw what they did." Emma's throat constricted. The image of her family's bodies, broken and bloody, among the shattered remains of their belongings, flashed before her eyes. She'd done what she could for them, dragging each to a shallow grave with strength born of grief and desperation. "You buried them," Thomas said, his voice gentler now. Not many would have had the courage to stay and do that. Something about his tone, respect perhaps, or simple human acknowledgement, broke through Emma's terror. She stepped away from the oak, still keeping a cautious distance. "They were my family," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "I couldn't just leave them." The words seemed pathetically inadequate to describe what she'd done, what she'd endured. Thomas nodded once, making no move to cross the stream that separated them. "You're hurt," he observed. "Hungry too, I'd wager. Your fire's more smoke than flame, and you've been eating berries that won't sustain you for long." Emma stiffened. "You've been watching me." "Tracking," he corrected. "It's what I do. The Riverton Marshal hired me to find who's responsible. For the attacks, 3 wagons in the past month, yours was the 4th. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." His eyes, dark and assessing, met hers across the water. "You're the first survivor." The words settled like stones in Emma's stomach. Not the first attack, not random banditry, but something coordinated, something purposeful. "Who are they?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider whether she wanted to know the answer. Thomas shook his head. "Not sure yet, but I mean to find out." He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something, holding it out toward her. "Here." Emma made no move to approach. "What is it?" "Pemmican, dried meat, fat, and berries. It'll keep you stronger than those blackberries you've been picking." When she still hesitated, he added, "If I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it while you slept last night." The blunt truth of his words sent a chill through her. He had been watching, could have approached her vulnerable camp at any time. Hunger finally overcame caution. Emma waded across the shallow stream, water soaking her skirts to the knees, and reached for the offered food. She stopped just beyond arm's reach, palm extended. Thomas placed the pemmican in her hand without trying to close the distance between them, then stepped back, giving her space. The gesture, small as it was, eased something in Emma's chest. She bit into the dense mixture, the flavor strong and unfamiliar, but undeniably nourishing. "Thank you," she said after swallowing the first bite. Thomas nodded once. "Your camp is too exposed. Smoke can be seen for miles in these hills." He gestured toward the west. "There's a better spot beneath a rock overhang about half a mile from here, hidden from view, protected from rain." He paused. "I can show you, or you can keep to your own place. Your choice." Emma studied him, trying to read intention in the impassive planes of his face. Everything she'd been taught warned against trusting a stranger in the wilderness, especially one with native blood. The newspapers in Charleston had been full of stories about conflicts with the remaining Cherokee who had avoided removal to Oklahoma Territory years earlier. But what choice did she have? Alone, she would likely die within days from exposure, starvation, or at the hands of the same bandits who had murdered her family. "Why help me?" she asked finally. Something flickered across Thomas's face, sorrow perhaps, or simply recognition. "Because surviving alone in these mountains is hard enough without carrying grief like yours." He turned slightly, indicating the direction with a tilt of his head. "Come or stay. I'll check the area for signs of the raiders either way." Emma hesitated only a moment longer. "I'll come," she said, the words feeling like surrender and salvation all at once. Thomas nodded and waited for her to finish the pemmican before leading the way through the forest. He moved differently now that she watched openly, still graceful but deliberately slower, easier to follow. Even so, Emma struggled to keep pace, her city-bred legs unused to navigating the uneven terrain. "You're from Charleston," he said after they'd walked in silence for several minutes. Not a question. Emma stumbled slightly over a root. "How did you know?" A hint of something that might have been amusement touched his expression. "Your shoes. Fine leather, city-made. Your dress, too. Too many layers for frontier living." He glanced back at her. "And your accent. Coastal Carolina sounds different than mountain folk." Emma felt exposed, as though he'd read more than just her origin from these details. "Yes," she admitted. "My father was a merchant. He wanted to establish new trade connections in the Western Territories." The past tense caught in her throat. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your father chose a dangerous time to travel these mountains." "What do you mean?" He ducked beneath a low-hanging branch, holding it aside for her to pass. "There's tension building. The Cherokee who remained after the removal, they've lived in an uneasy peace with settlers for years now. But something's changed, raids increasing, trust breaking down." "You think natives attacked our wagon?" Emma asked, the food in her stomach suddenly feeling like lead. Thomas's expression hardened. "I didn't say that. These attacks don't follow Cherokee patterns. Too much wasted, too much." He seemed to search for a word. "Spectacle." They crested a small rise, and Thomas pointed to a formation ahead, a natural overhang of rock creating a sheltered hollow beneath. It was indeed better than her previous camp, defensible with rock at her back and a clear view of approaches. "Rest here," Thomas said. "I need to check the wider area, see if our friends have passed nearby." He reached into his pack and produced more pemmican and a small water skin. "This will last until tomorrow." Emma took the offerings, acutely aware of her dependence on this stranger's goodwill. "You're coming back then?" Something that might have been surprise crossed his features. "No. Yes, those men need to be found, and you need to reach Riverton safely." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you'd prefer I send someone else for you." The thought of waiting alone for some unknown rescuer from town made Emma's chest tighten with fresh anxiety. As strange as it seemed, she found herself trusting this man more than the abstract promise of help from Riverton. "No," she said. "I'd rather, if you wouldn't mind being the one to return." Thomas nodded once, acceptance without judgment. "Make no fire until I come back. Stay hidden." His eyes met hers, serious and intent. "Can you use a weapon?" Emma thought of the kitchen knife, practically useless against any real threat. "I know. My father never thought it proper for a lady to handle firearms." Thomas reached down and pulled a second knife from his boot, smaller than his hunting blade, but far more substantial than her salvaged utensil. He offered it to her. "Handle first. Keep this close. If someone comes that isn't me, aim for the throat or stomach and don't hesitate." The brutal practicality of his advice should have horrified her. Instead, Emma found herself taking the knife with steady hands, testing its weight and balance. After what she'd witnessed on the mountain pass, self-preservation outweighed social niceties. "Thank you," she said simply. Thomas inclined his head slightly. "I'll return before sundown." With that, he turned and melted into the forest with that same fluid grace, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts and his knife clutched in her hand. She settled beneath the rock overhang, arranging her tattered skirts around her, as if preparing for a social call rather than survival. Old habits, she supposed. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "A lady maintains her standards even in difficult circumstances." Martha Wilson had maintained hers until the very end, facing the bandits with a straight back and proud eyes, even as their leader leveled his pistol at her chest. Emma's throat tightened. She would not cry again. Tears solved nothing and left, her eyes swollen and her head aching, luxuries of grief she could not afford in this wilderness. Instead, she examined Thomas's knife more closely. The handle was worn smooth, the blade clean and wickedly sharp. Cherokee craftsmanship, perhaps, or acquired through trade. Like the man himself, it seemed to exist between two worlds. Thomas, Rivers, Hawkeye. Not fully Cherokee, not fully white, trusted by neither world completely, she imagined. Yet the Riverton marshal had hired him to track the raiders, which suggested his skills were valued even if he himself might not be. Emma wondered, What circumstances had led him to become a tracker, to develop the abilities that let him read the forest like a book while she stumbled blindly through its pages? The relative safety of the overhang and the nourishment of the pemmican allowed Emma's mind to truly process her situation for the first time since the attack. She was alone in an unfamiliar wilderness. Her family, everyone she loved in the world, was dead. The life she had known, with its predictable rhythms and social expectations, had ended as abruptly as a candle snuffed by the wind. If she survived, to reach Riverton, what then? Return to Charleston, to distant relatives who had disapproved of her father's Western ambitions? Throw herself on the mercy of strangers in the frontier town? Neither option held much appeal, yet the luxury of choice seemed absurd when merely living through the next day remained uncertain. Emma leaned back against the cool stone, Thomas's knife resting across her lap. She would think about tomorrow when it came. For now, she focused on the immediate. The overhang protected her from view. The pemmican had blunted the worst edge of hunger, and Thomas Rivers had promised to return. In the wilderness of the Blue Ridge Mountains, those small certainties would have to be enough. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Emma dozed fitfully, each snapping twig or rustle of leaves jolting her back to panicked alertness. The shadows lengthened as afternoon surrendered to early evening, painting the forest in deepening shades of amber and gold. She began to wonder if Thomas had abandoned her after all, or worse, encountered the same bandits who had attacked her family. Just as the first tendrils of genuine fear began to creep through her, a soft whistle sounded from the trees below. 2 notes, rising and falling. A bird call, but too deliberate to be natural. Emma tensed, gripping the knife tightly. Thomas emerged from between 2 pines, moving with that same silent grace. His expression, usually composed, now held something darker. Concern, perhaps, or anger carefully controlled. "They've been here," he said without preamble, crouching at the edge of her shelter. "Not at your camp, but nearby, heading east toward Devil's Backbone." Emma's pulse quickened. "The men who attacked us?" "Yes, 5, maybe 6 men on horseback. Heavy loads, probably your family's belongings and anything valuable from the wagon." His jaw tightened. "They're not moving like men concerned about pursuit." "They think no one survived to identify them," Emma realized aloud. Thomas nodded, grimly. "Which gives us an advantage, albeit a small one." He settled more comfortably, crossing his legs beneath him. "Did you see their faces? Could you identify them?" Emma closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember details she'd tried desperately to forget. There were 7 of them. Their leader, he wore a marshal's badge. She opened her eyes to see Thomas watching her intently. Not a Riverton badge, different shape, star instead of shield. "Describe him." "Tall, older than the others. Gray. In his beard, a scar here." She traced a line from her right eyebrow to cheekbone. He spoke. Educated. Not like a common bandit. The memory made her stomach churn. "He called my father by name before he shot him." Thomas went very still. "He knew your father?" "I don't think so. Not personally, but he knew we were coming. Called him Merchant Wilson and said something about messages not being delivered." Emma wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the lingering warmth of the day. My father looked confused, like he didn't understand the reference. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "The marshal who hired me is called Silas Blackwood. Scar matches your description." Emma felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath her. "The same man who hired you to track the raiders is the one leading them?" The implications spun outward, dizzying in their complexity. "But why? Why murder innocent travelers?" "I don't know. Not yet." Thomas's voice was calm, but Emma sensed the controlled anger beneath. But something larger is happening here. 4 wagon attacks in a month, all made to look like Cherokee raids. Tensions rising, fear spreading. His eyes met hers, serious and intent. And you, the only witness, hidden in these woods. He doesn't know I survived, Emma said, the realization both terrifying and empowering. If he knew, he'd have sent men back to search more thoroughly. Thomas nodded once. You're valuable now, Emma Wilson. Your testimony could expose whatever game Blackwood is playing. He reached into his pack and produced more food. Not just pemmican this time, but dried apple slices and what looked like cornbread. Eat. Tomorrow we move. To Riverton? Emma asked, accepting the food with murmured thanks. No, Riverton isn't safe for you now. Thomas gazed out at the darkening forest. There's a Cherokee settlement at Hidden Springs. My mother's cousin is an elder there. We'll find sanctuary while I learn more about Blackwood's activities. Emma hesitated, the cornbread halfway to her mouth. A Cherokee settlement. Will they welcome a white woman? Something that might have been amusement flickered in Thomas's eyes. They tolerate me, and I'm only half Cherokee. Besides, my people understand the concept of sanctuary better than most. You'll be safe there. He paused. Unless you have objections to seeking help from natives. The challenge in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Emma thought of the stories she'd heard all her life, savages, heathens, uncivilized. Then she thought of the civilized men who had murdered her family in cold blood, and of this man who had offered help when she most needed it. No, she said firmly, no objections. I'm grateful for any safe harbor. She took a bite of the cornbread, finding it surprisingly sweet. How far is this settlement? A day's journey northwest, difficult terrain. Thomas studied her torn dress and impractical shoes with a critical eye. You'll need different clothes. Those skirts will catch on everything, and those shoes won't last another day in these mountains. Emma glanced down at her ruined garments. Under normal circumstances, the suggestion of changing into anything other than proper women's attire would have been scandalous. Now it seemed merely practical. I have nothing else, she admitted. Thomas nodded as if he'd expected this answer. I'll return at first light. Try to rest. He rose in one fluid motion, preparing to leave. Wait, Emma said, surprising herself with her boldness. You're not staying. He paused, looking down at her with an unreadable expression. Would you prefer I did? The honest answer was yes. Despite having known him less than a day, Thomas Rivers represented safety in a world suddenly devoid of it, but Emma recognized the impropriety of such an admission. The men who attacked us, what if they return? They won't, Thomas said with quiet confidence. They're headed east, away from here, and I need to arrange things for tomorrow. His expression softened slightly. The overhang hides you well. Keep the knife close, and I'll return before you wake. Emma nodded, accepting the necessity, if not the comfort, of his departure. Thank you for everything. Thomas acknowledged her gratitude with a slight inclination of his head. Rest, Emma Wilson. Tomorrow will test your strength in new ways. With that, he disappeared into the gathering darkness as silently as he had arrived. Emma settled back against the stone wall of her shelter, the knife once again across her lap. Above, through gaps in the forest canopy, the first stars pricked the deepening blue of the evening sky. Somewhere in that same sky, her mother had always told her, the departed looked down on those left behind. I'm still here, she whispered to the stars, to her family, to herself. I'm still here. Sleep came eventually, fitful but necessary. As the forest settled into the quiet rhythms of night around her, Emma dreamed of wagons and arrows, of marshals with scarred faces and Cherokee trackers with knowing eyes. And somewhere in those dreams, a seed of something unexpected took root, not just the will to survive, but the determination to understand why her family had died and who had arranged it. When dawn broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains, Emma Wilson woke changed, no longer merely a victim of circumstance, but a woman with purpose. Thomas Rivers would return as promised, and together they would journey to Hidden Springs. What came after that, only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the lone survivor of the wagon attack would not fade quietly into the forest shadows. Not while the man responsible still wore a marshal's badge in Riverton. Not while questions remained unanswered and justice unserved. Emma tightened her grip on Thomas's knife and waited for the new day to begin. True to his word, Thomas returned. At first light, materializing from the misty forest like a spirit. He carried a bundle under one arm and wore a determined expression that immediately put Emma on alert. "We need to move quickly," he said without greeting. Blackwood's men were in Riverton last night, drinking and talking freely. "Word of your father's wagon being found has reached town." Emma sat up straighter, instantly alert despite her poor sleep. "Do they know I survived?" "No, but they're sending men to recover what's left of the wagon today. If they find signs." "You escaped." He let the implication hang in the air between them. Emma nodded, already gathering the few pitiful possessions she'd salvaged. The tin cup, her kitchen knife, a handkerchief with her mother's embroidered initials. "I'm ready." Thomas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Here," he said, offering the bundle he carried. "You'll need these." Emma unwrapped the package to find clothing, buckskin leggings, a man's cotton shirt, moccasins, and a worn leather belt. Her cheeks warmed slightly at the impropriety, but practicality overcame social convention. "Turn around," she said quietly. Thomas obliged without comment, facing away from the overhang while Emma changed as quickly as her stiff muscles allowed. The leggings felt strange against her skin after years of petticoats and skirts, but the freedom of movement was immediate and undeniable. The shirt hung loose on her smaller frame, but could be belted at the waist. The moccasins, surprisingly, fit almost perfectly. "I'm decent," she said when she'd finished. Thomas turned, his eyes assessing her new attire with a practical gaze. "Better. You'll move faster now, and quieter too." He gestured to her ruined dress. "Leave it. Nothing that could tell them who was here." Emma hesitated. The dress, tattered and stained as it was, represented her last connection to her former life. But Thomas was right. It could identify her, and right now anonymity was safety. She folded it carefully and tucked it beneath a rock at the back of the overhang. "Let's go," she said with more conviction than she felt. Thomas nodded once and led the way into the forest, setting a pace that challenged Emma's endurance from the start. The terrain grew steadily more difficult, steeper, rockier, the undergrowth thicker. Occasionally, Thomas would stop, examining some sign invisible to Emma's untrained eyes, then adjust their course slightly. "You're masking our trail," she observed during one such pause. He glanced back at her, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Yes, taking routes that leave minimal sign, hard surfaces, moving water when possible." Emma nodded, filing the knowledge away. "Teach me, please, I want to understand." Thomas studied her for a moment, as though weighing the sincerity of her request. "Pay attention to how you place your feet. Soft earth holds impressions, rock doesn't. Always step on roots or stones when you can." He gestured at a patch of moss she'd been about to step on. "That compresses. Shows where you've been for hours afterward." Emma adjusted her step, placing her foot on a flat stone instead. The small change required consciousness, intention, She found herself watching Thomas more carefully, noting how he moved through the forest with minimal disturbance, a skill born of years of practice and ancestral knowledge. They continued in relative silence, conserving breath for the increasingly difficult climb. Emma's legs burned with the unaccustomed exertion, but she refused to complain or ask for rest. Every step took her further from the nightmare at Settlers Pass and the men who had created it. By midday, they had reached a ridgeline that offered a sweeping view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Thomas finally called a halt, indicating a fallen tree where Emma could rest. She sank onto it gratefully, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're doing well," Thomas said, offering her the water skin. Most city folk would have collapsed hours ago. Emma accepted the water, taking small sips as she'd learned to do. "Fear is a powerful motivator," she said wryly. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across Thomas's face. So is vengeance. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous. Emma had not allowed herself to name the burning, feeling that had taken root overnight, but Thomas had identified it with unerring accuracy. Vengeance. Justice. Whatever name it took, the desire to see Silas Blackwood answer for her family's murder had become a driving force as powerful as survival itself. "Can we?" she asked quietly. "Make him pay for what he's done?" Thomas's expression turned grim. "Not easily, and not quickly. Blackwood has power in Riverton, connections beyond it. Whatever game he's playing with these raids, it serves someone's interests." He studied the distant mountains thoughtfully. "But yes, with patience and the right evidence, he can be brought down." "Evidence," Emma repeated, the word tasting bitter. "My word against a marshal's won't count for much. Your word alone, no. But if we can determine why he's staging these attacks, who benefits from them?" Thomas trailed off, his attention suddenly focused on something to the west. He rose in one fluid motion, eyes narrowed. Smoke. Too much for a campfire. Emma stood shakily, following his gaze. A thin column of dark smoke rose above the tree line, perhaps 2 miles distant, smudging the clear blue sky. "What is it?" she asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's near Hidden Springs, my mother's people." He slung his pack over his shoulder with a new urgency. "We need to move. Now." The pace he set was punishing, but Emma followed without complaint, pushing her exhausted body beyond what she had believed possible. The ridgeline provided faster travel than the dense forest below, and Thomas took full advantage, moving with a speed born of genuine fear. "Could it be Blackwood's men?" Emma asked when they paused briefly for water. Thomas shook his head. "Unlikely. Hidden Springs is isolated off any regular trade routes. Few white men even know of its existence." His expression darkened. But if someone wanted to increase tensions between settlers and Cherokee, the implication was clear. If Blackwood was staging raids to appear as though natives were attacking settlers, the reverse would be equally effective, attacking a Cherokee settlement and making it look like the work of white men. They pressed on, the smoke growing thicker as they approached. Thomas led them off the ridgeline and into the forest, taking a more circuitous route that offered concealment. The smell of burning wood grew stronger, carrying other scents that Emma couldn't identify, but that made Thomas's expression harden further. When they finally reached the outskirts of what must have been Hidden Springs, Thomas held up a hand, signaling Emma to stop. He crouched low, surveying the scene ahead with practiced caution. Emma knelt beside him, her eyes widening at the devastation. The settlement had consisted of perhaps a dozen structures, some traditional Cherokee dwellings, others built in a more European style, reflecting the adaptation of a people caught between two worlds. Now most lay in smoldering ruins. Bodies were scattered across the central clearing, men and women alike. No distinction had been made between warriors and elders. "God in heaven," Emma whispered, bile rising in her throat. Thomas's face had gone rigid, a mask that barely contained the grief and rage beneath. "Stay here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to check for survivors." Emma nodded mutely, watching as he moved into the clearing with the same silent grace, but now laden with visible tension. He checked each body with gentle efficiency, closing eyes, murmuring words she couldn't hear. Prayers, perhaps, or promises. None showed signs of life. The systematic slaughter reminded Emma painfully of her own family's murder, but on a larger scale. This wasn't random violence or even simple theft. This was extermination. Thomas knelt beside the body of an elderly woman for longer than the others, his hand resting briefly on her forehead. His great-aunt, Emma realized with a pang of empathy. The relative he had hoped would offer them sanctuary. Lost in her thoughts, Emma almost missed the slight movement at the edge of the clearing, a figure darting between burned structures. She tensed, searching for Thomas to alert him, but he had moved behind one of the few standing buildings. Instinctively, she reached for the knife at her belt, prepared to call out a warning. The figure emerged again, and Emma froze in shock. A child, no more than 7 or 8 years old, covered in soot and blood, but moving with desperate purpose toward the forest on the far side of the settlement. A survivor. Emma rose to her feet, prepared to go to the child, when a second movement caught her eye. A man, dressed in frontier clothing, rifle raised toward the fleeing child's back. One of the attackers, left behind to eliminate any survivors. Without conscious thought, Emma burst from her hiding place, sprinting across the clearing toward the child. "Thomas!" she screamed, her voice shattering the eerie quiet. "There!" The rifleman swung toward the sound of her voice momentarily, distracted from his intended target. In that split second of hesitation, Thomas emerged from behind the building, his own weapon raised. The shot rang out, echoing across the mountain valley, and the rifleman crumpled to the ground. Emma reached the child, a boy, she realized, with wide, terrified eyes, and pulled him into her arms just as his legs gave way beneath him. He struggled briefly, then went limp with exhaustion or relief. She couldn't tell which. Thomas was beside them in moments, checking the boy for injuries. His solemn face softened slightly when he spoke to the child in Cherokee. Gentle questions that received only frightened stares in response. He switched to English. "Are you hurt? Can you tell me your name?" The boy shook his head, then nodded, clearly confused by the compound question. "Joseph," he whispered finally. "My English name is Joseph." Thomas nodded encouragingly. "Joseph, did you see who did this?" The boy's eyes filled with tears. Men on horses, white men. They came at dawn when most still slept. His voice broke. "They shot my father when he tried to talk to them. Said it was justice for the raids on the wagons." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The confirmation of her suspicions did nothing to lessen the horror of their realization. "Blackwood," she whispered. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Did you see their leader, Joseph? A tall man with a scar on his face?" The boy nodded slowly. He wore a star, like lawmen wear. His small body began to tremble. He watched, didn't stop them. Emma pulled the child closer, as much for her own comfort as his. The cold calculation of it all made her physically ill. Blackwood had orchestrated attacks on settlers, blamed them on the Cherokee, then used that as justification to massacre an innocent village, further inflaming tensions, and ensuring that frontier justice would demand retribution against all remaining native settlements. But to what end? What purpose could such bloodshed possibly serve? Thomas rose, moving to check the fallen rifleman with efficient movements. "Dead," he confirmed, returning with the man's weapon and ammunition. Not one of Blackwood's deputies. Hired gun, most likely. His expression was grim. They'll be back when he doesn't return. We need to move. Where? Emma asked. Hidden Springs was supposed to be our sanctuary. Thomas looked out over the destroyed settlement, grief etching. Lines around his eyes and mouth. There's another place, smaller, harder to find, a day's journey north. He glanced down at Joseph. Can you walk, little warrior? We must go far from here. The boy straightened, wiping tears from his soot-streaked face. I can walk, he said, with dignity beyond his years. Emma helped him to his feet, noting the moment when Thomas's grief transformed visibly into hardened resolve. Whatever reluctance he might have felt about confronting Blackwood directly seemed to vanish in the face of the massacre. We need to bury them, Emma said quietly, looking at the fallen Cherokee. Thomas shook his head. No time, and it would. Leave sign that survivors were here. His voice softened at Emma's expression. I've said the proper words. Their spirits are on the path. The flesh is just flesh now. The pragmatism felt cruel, but Emma recognized its necessity. She took Joseph's small hand in hers. We're ready. Thomas led them away from Hidden Springs, taking a route that crossed rocky ground where their tracks would be minimized. The boy moved with surprising stamina, his young legs already accustomed to the mountains that still challenged Emma's endurance. When he stumbled, exhaustion finally overcoming determination, Thomas lifted him effortlessly, carrying him piggyback as they continued their journey. They traveled until full darkness made further progress dangerous, finding shelter in a dense thicket that offered concealment without the constraints of a cave or overhang that might trap them. Thomas dared no fire, so they huddled together for warmth, Joseph finally succumbing to sleep between them. How did they know about Hidden Springs? Emma whispered, when the boy's breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of slumber. Thomas's face was shadowed in the darkness, but she could sense the tension in his body. Someone told them, someone who knew the location. His voice hardened. There aren't many who could have. A traitor? Or a tortured prisoner? There was a hunting party out 3 days ago. They never returned. He shifted slightly, adjusting Joseph's position. But it doesn't matter now. What matters is keeping you both alive and finding proof of Blackwood's treachery. Emma was silent for a moment, processing the magnitude of what they faced. Why, Thomas? Why go to such lengths? What does Blackwood gain from all this bloodshed? Thomas sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of history. Land, most likely. The remaining Cherokee holdings include territories recently discovered to contain gold deposits. Not large ones, but valuable nonetheless. If tensions rise enough, the territorial governor might order removal of all remaining Cherokee. Treaty. Rights be damned. So it's about money, Emma said bitterly. My family died for gold they didn't even know existed. Money and power always entwine, Thomas replied. Your father was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. A convenient victim to further Blackwood's plans. They fell silent, the forest sounds creating a cocoon of whispers around them. Emma's exhaustion was bone deep, but her mind refused to quiet, spinning with images of Hidden Springs, of her family's final moments, of Blackwood's calculating brutality. We'll stop him, she said finally. The words, half promise, half prayer. Thomas's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. Yes, he said simply, we will. Dawn arrived with misty tendrils creeping through the forest canopy. Emma woke to find Thomas already alert, his back against a tree trunk, the rifle across his knees. Young Joseph still slept, his face peaceful despite the horrors he had witnessed. The innocence of childhood provided mercies even in the darkest circumstances. We need to move soon, Thomas said quietly, noting her wakefulness. Blackwood's men will be searching by now. Emma nodded, wincing as she sat up. Every muscle in her body protested the previous day's exertion and the hard ground that had served as her bed. The buckskin clothing Thomas had provided felt stiff and foreign against her skin, but she was grateful for its practicality. Her Charleston dresses would have been shredded by the rough journey through the mountain underbrush. "How far to this other settlement?" she asked, accepting the waterskin Thomas offered. "If we maintain a good pace, we can reach it by nightfall." His expression suggested doubt about her ability to manage such a journey, though he was too polite to voice it. "It's called Whispering Pines. Just 3 families, those who refuse to join either the larger Cherokee settlements or go west during the removal." Emma glanced down at Joseph, still lost in the healing embrace of sleep. "Will they take us in, after what happened at Hidden Springs?" "They will," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "Grandmother Willow leads them. She's respected, even feared by some. If anyone will stand against Blackwood, it's her." The name carried weight in Thomas's voice, suggesting a relationship more complex than mere acquaintance. Emma wondered briefly about his connection to this mysterious woman, but knew the time for such questions would come later. For now, survival demanded priority. "Should we wake him?" she asked, brushing a lock of dark hair from Joseph's forehead. Thomas shook his head. "Let him have a few more minutes. I'll find us something to eat first." He handed her the rifle. "Keep this close. If you hear anything at all, wake the boy and head north. Follow the rising sun on your right shoulder." The responsibility settled on Emma like a physical weight, but she took the weapon without protest. Her father had never allowed her to handle firearms, considering them unladylike and unnecessary. Now her life and Joseph's might depend on her willingness to use one. "How do I?" she began, examining the unfamiliar rifle. Thomas spent a few minutes showing her the basics: how to check if it was loaded, how to aim, how to pull the trigger without flinching. The lesson was rudimentary at best, but it was better than complete ignorance. "I'll stay close," he promised, then disappeared into the forest with that same fluid silence that had first marked him as different from any man Emma had known before. Left alone with the sleeping boy and the rifle, Emma found herself studying their surroundings more carefully than she had the previous night. The thicket provided good concealment, with dense undergrowth surrounding a small clearing just large, enough for the 3 of them. Through gaps in the foliage, she could see a stream running perhaps 50 yards away, its gentle gurgle barely audible from their position. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched in every direction, their ancient slopes, clothed in unbroken forest. Beautiful, Emma thought, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. These peaks had witnessed centuries of bloodshed, native wars, colonial conflicts, the brutal displacement of the Cherokee, and now this latest chapter of violence orchestrated by Silas Blackwood. The mountains would remain long after all of them were dust. Joseph stirred, his small face contorting as consciousness brought back the memories of Hidden Springs. Emma reached out instinctively, touching his shoulder gently. "Good morning," she said softly. "You're safe." The boy's eyes flew open, wild with momentary panic before focusing on her face. Recognition dawned, along with the weight of remembered grief. But children possessed remarkable resilience. After a moment, Joseph sat up, rubbing his eyes with grimy fists. "Where is Hawkeye?" he asked, using Thomas's Cherokee name. "Finding breakfast," Emma replied, offering him water. "He'll be back soon." Joseph drank thirstily, then settled cross-legged beside her, his small shoulders squared with dignity beyond his years. "You are not Cherokee," he observed, "yet you help us." Emma was struck by the simple wisdom of the statement. "No, I'm not dumb, but the same men who hurt your people also killed my family. I think perhaps that makes us allies." The boy considered this, his dark eyes serious. My father said we must judge each person by their actions, not the color of their skin. His voice wavered slightly on the mention of his father. He would say you have a good heart. The unconditional acceptance in his words touched something deep within Emma. She had been raised with Charleston's rigid social hierarchies, where worth was determined by family name, wealth, and adherence to proper behavior. Here in the wilderness, stripped of all social context, she was being judged solely on her willingness to help a child in need. Your father sounds like a wise man, she said gently. Joseph nodded solemnly. He was a healer. He knew the old ways, and the new medicine too. Pride warred with grief in his young voice. I was learning from him. The revelation added another layer of tragedy to the massacre at Hidden Springs. Not just lives lost, but knowledge, wisdom accumulated over generations, now vanished forever. Emma wondered how many other skills and traditions had been snuffed out in Blackwood's calculated violence. A whisper of movement drew her attention. She tensed, raising the rifle awkwardly, then relaxed as Thomas materialized from between two pines. He carried several plants and what appeared to be a rabbit, already skinned and cleaned. Found breakfast, he said, noting Joseph's wakefulness with a nod of acknowledgement. No fire, but we can eat this safely. He set about cutting the meat into thin strips alongside various roots and berries he had foraged. Joseph identified some of the plants for Emma, a type of wild onion, young dandelion greens, blackberries still tart with spring's lingering coolness. The raw rabbit was a challenge for Emma's city-bred sensibilities, but hunger overcame disgust. She ate without complaint, recognizing the gift of protein for what it was, necessary fuel for the journey ahead. As they finished their sparse meal, Thomas outlined their plan for the day. We'll follow the ridgeline north as long as we can, harder to track us on stony ground, then drop into the valley before Widow's Peak. Whispering Pines lies in the shadow of the mountain. Will they be watching for us? Emma asked, the question encompassing both potential sanctuary at Whispering Pines and pursuit from Blackwood's men. Thomas's expression darkened. Blackwood won't expect survivors from Hidden Springs to head north. Most would flee south toward the larger Cherokee settlements beyond the territorial border. As for Grandmother Willow, a hint of something, like amusement, touched his features. She has ways of knowing when visitors approach. The cryptic answer raised more questions than it answered, but Emma sensed this wasn't the time to press for details. She helped Joseph wipe his hands clean on moss gathered from a nearby tree, then assisted Thomas in eliminating all signs of their brief camp. It was becoming second nature already, this careful erasure of presence, the conscious effort to move through the world without disturbing it enough to leave traces. They set out as the morning mist began to burn away, Thomas setting a pace that challenged Emma but remained manageable for Joseph's shorter legs. The boy moved with surprising agility, clearly accustomed to forest travel in ways Emma was still learning. When they reached a fallen tree or difficult ascent, he often showed her where to place her feet or which branches would bear her weight. "You're a good teacher," she told him during a brief rest, earning a solemn nod in return. "My father said, teaching is how knowledge stays alive." Joseph's matter-of-fact tone belied the profound wisdom of the statement. Thomas, overhearing, added softly, "The Cherokee believe that when we share our knowledge, it cannot be truly destroyed, even if we die what we have taught lives on in others." The sentiment resonated with unexpected power. Emma thought of her own family, her father's merchant wisdom, her mother's social graces, even her younger brother's enthusiastic knowledge of literature and history. All of it lost now, unless she carried it forward somehow. "Then we must ensure Joseph has the chance to share what his father taught him," she said with quiet determination. Thomas met her eyes, something like respect kindling in his gaze. Yes, we must. They continued their journey, the miles passing beneath their feet as the sun climbed toward noon. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, forcing them to navigate narrow game trails and occasionally scramble up steep inclines, using roots and rocks as handholds. Emma's hands, once soft and carefully maintained, were now scratched and dirt-ingrained. She found herself strangely unconcerned by this transformation. It was Joseph who first noticed the shift in the forest's mood. He stopped abruptly, his head tilted like a bird listening for distant danger. "What is it?" Emma asked, instantly alert to his concern. "The birds," he said simply. "They've gone quiet." Thomas materialized beside them, having ranged ahead to scout their path. His expression confirmed Joseph's observation. Something was wrong. "Stay here," he murmured, slipping into the undergrowth with that same liquid grace. Emma drew Joseph close, her hand dropping instinctively to the knife at her belt. The forest held its breath around them, the usual background chorus of birdsong and insect hum notably absent. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving an unnatural stillness that raised the fine hairs on Emma's arms. Minutes stretched like hours. Joseph pressed against her side, his small body tense but controlled. Whatever had happened at Hidden Springs, the boy had clearly been taught how to behave in moments of danger, staying quiet, remaining still, controlling his fear. When Thomas finally returned, his expression was grim. "Riders," he said quietly, "5 of them moving along the valley floor below us, looking for tracks." "Blackwood's men?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Thomas nodded once. "The man I shot at Hidden Springs was supposed to meet them. When he didn't show, they started searching." His jaw tightened. "They have dogs." The implications chilled Emma's blood. Footprints might be concealed, campsites disguised, but scent was nearly impossible to mask completely, especially from trained tracking hounds. "What do we do?" she whispered. Thomas glanced at the sky, calculating. "Change direction. They expect survivors to head south. We're going north, but if the dogs catch our scent, it won't matter." "So we outpace them?" Emma asked doubtfully, painfully aware of her own limitations and Joseph's age. "No." Thomas's expression was resolute. "We use the land against them. There's a place ahead, a narrow gorge with a waterfall. We follow the creek upstream, leaving no tracks. The water will mask our scent." It sounded desperately risky, but Emma could see no alternative. She squeezed Joseph's shoulder reassuringly. "We can do this." The boy nodded, his eyes grave but determined. "Like stalking deer," he said. "Move with the water, not against it." Thomas smiled slightly at the boy's understanding. "Exactly. Now, we move quickly but carefully. Follow exactly where I step." They altered course, angling northeast toward the sound of rushing water that Emma could now discern in the distance. The forest began to slope downward, the undergrowth thickening as they approached the creek Thomas had mentioned. When they reached it, Emma understood his strategy. The water ran swift and clear over a rocky bed, leaving no mud where footprints might form. "We follow this up to the falls," Thomas explained, already stepping carefully from stone to stone. "In the shallow water, the dogs will lose our scent where we enter the creek, and the men won't expect us to go uphill toward rougher terrain." Emma helped Joseph navigate the slippery stones, then followed them into the cold mountain stream. The water numbed her feet almost instantly, soaking through the moccasins Thomas had provided, but discomfort was a small price for survival. She focused on placing each foot securely, knowing that a fall now might mean injury they couldn't afford, or noise that might carry to their pursuers. The creek bed grew steeper, the water flowing more rapidly as they ascended. Occasionally, Thomas would direct them to step out briefly onto a rock outcropping, then back into the water at a different point. a precaution against trackers who might search along the banks for the place where they exited. After nearly an hour of this painstaking progress, the distant sound of barking reached them. Emma's heart leapt into her throat, but Thomas merely gestured for them to continue without breaking stride. "The dogs found where we camped," he said, quietly when she drew alongside him. "But the scent trail ends at the creek. They'll search in widening circles, assuming we crossed it rather than followed it." "And if they guess correctly?" Emma couldn't help asking. Thomas's hand moved subtly to the knife at his belt. "Then we deal with that when it comes. For now, we keep moving." The waterfall announced itself long before they saw it, a steadily increasing roar that vibrated through the forest air. When they rounded a final bend in the creek, Emma gasped, despite their precarious situation. Crescent Falls lived up to its name, a perfect arc of white water cascading over a stone lip at least 60 feet high. The creek they'd been following emerged from a cleft at the top of this natural formation. "We climb," Thomas said, indicating a narrow path that zigzagged up the cliff face beside the falls. Emma eyed the steep ascent with trepidation. "Is there no other way?" "Not unless you want to meet Blackwood's men." Thomas's bluntness was oddly reassuring, practical rather than cruel. "The path is better than it looks. The spray from the falls keeps the moss thick. Good handholds." Joseph had already started up, moving with the natural agility of childhood. Emma watched him for a moment, noting where he placed his hands and feet, then began her own climb. The rock face was indeed less sheer than it had initially appeared, with plenty of natural ledges and crevices for hands and feet. The challenge came from the constant spray that made every surface slick and the thundering noise of the falls that made communication nearly impossible. Thomas followed behind her, occasionally placing a guiding hand at her back when she hesitated too long between movements. The physical contact should have seemed improper, a strange man touching a lady without permission, but context had stripped away such social niceties. His hand represented safety, not impropriety. Halfway up, disaster nearly struck. Emma reached for a seemingly solid handhold, only to have the moss tear away beneath her fingers. She slipped, a cry escaping her lips as her foot likewise lost purchase. For one heart-stopping moment, she hung suspended by a single hand, the drop below her suddenly vertiginous and terrifying. Then Thomas was there, his arm around her waist, his strength effortlessly supporting her until she could re-establish her footing. His face betrayed no fear or concern, only focused determination. When she had regained her position, he simply nodded once and continued upward, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The rest of the climb passed without incident, though Emma's heart continued to race long after the moment of danger had passed. When they finally reached the top, emerging onto a relatively flat outcropping above the falls, she collapsed onto the rocky ground, her limbs trembling with exertion and delayed fear. Joseph crouched beside her, patting her arm with surprising gentleness. "You climbed well," he said solemnly, "for someone not born to the mountains." The simple acceptance in his words, acknowledging her limitations without judgment, brought an unexpected smile to Emma's lips. "Thank you, Joseph. I'm learning." Thomas had moved to the edge of the outcropping, surveying the forest below. From this vantage point, they could see for miles across the rolling expanse of the Blue Ridge. In the far distance, a thin column of smoke still rose from what must be the ruins of hidden springs. "There," Thomas said, pointing to a spot in the valley below. "Blackwood's men, the dogs have lost our trail." Emma joined him carefully, staying well back from the edge. She could just make out tiny figures on horseback, moving in a search pattern along the creek they had followed. The distance made them seem insignificant, mere insects crawling across the vastness of the mountain landscape. "Will they give up?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. Not entirely, but they'll assume we're heading south toward the larger Cherokee settlements. They'll concentrate their search in that direction. Buying us time to reach Whispering Pines? Emma concluded.
Bah!
Yes, we should reach it by nightfall if we maintain a good pace. Thomas turned from the view, addressing both Emma and Joseph. Rest for a few minutes. Eat something. The path ahead is easier but longer. They shared the remaining food from Thomas's pack, strips of dried venison, some nuts, and the last of the berries they had gathered. Emma found herself ravenously hungry despite the morning's breakfast, her body demanding fuel after the exertion of the climb. As they ate, she studied Thomas covertly. The half-Cherokee tracker remained an enigma in many ways. His past, his motivations, the depth of his connection to the people of Hidden Springs and Whispering Pines. Yet she trusted him implicitly, a trust born not from naivete, but from his consistent action since finding her by the stream. "Thomas," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over their small group. "If Blackwood is after Cherokee land for the gold deposits, why attack settler wagons as well? Why kill my family?" And Thomas considered the question seriously, respect in his gaze rather than condescension. "Two reasons, I think. First, to create fear and suspicion of the Cherokee. If settlers believe they're under attack, they'll demand action against all natives in the territory. And the second reason," Emma prompted when he paused, "control of who settles in the region." Thomas's gaze moved to the distant mountains, thoughtful. "Your father was a merchant looking to establish trade. Independent businessmen with capital are dangerous to men like Blackwood. They ask questions, notice patterns, might discover the gold or realize the raids aren't what they seem." The explanation made a terrible kind of sense. Emma's father had always been curious, observant, quick to spot opportunities others missed. If he had established himself in Riverton, he might indeed have uncovered whatever scheme Blackwood was running. "So it wasn't random," she said quietly. "He was targeted specifically." Thomas met her eyes directly. "I believe so, yes. Which means Blackwood had information about your family's travel plans before you arrived." The implication hung in the air between them. Someone in Charleston, someone her father had trusted with their itinerary, had betrayed them to Blackwood. The circle of conspiracy widened, extending far beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. Joseph, who had been listening intently to this adult conversation, spoke up unexpectedly. "The bad marshal has friends in high places," he said, the phrase clearly, one he had heard from adults. "That's what my father said about the gold, that men in Richmond and even Washington know about it." Thomas looked at the boy with sharp interest. "Your father spoke of this recently?" Joseph nodded, proud to contribute meaningful information. "Last council, he said papers came from the territorial governor about moving us again." His young face clouded. "Father was angry, said we had rights to this land by treaty." "Did he say who sent these papers?" Thomas asked gently. "Any names?" The boy's brow furrowed in concentration. "Blake, Blackwood, Emma supplied quietly. Joseph nodded vigorously. "Yes, and another name, Harrison, from Richmond." Thomas and Emma exchanged glances. The pieces were beginning to align into a coherent picture. Blackwood working with someone in the territorial government, orchestrating violence to justify removing the remaining Cherokee, all to access gold deposits on treaty-protected land. "Joseph," Thomas said seriously, "what your father knew, what you've just told us, it's very important. It could help stop the bad marshal from hurting more people. Can you remember anything else about these papers, or what your father said?" The boy thought hard, clearly wanting to help, but limited by his young memory and understanding. He said, "They were not honest, that the paper claimed we attacked settlers, but we didn't." His eyes glistened suddenly with unshed tears. "We just wanted to be left alone." Emma reached out instinctively, drawing the child into a gentle embrace. He stiffened momentarily, then relaxed against her, accepting the comfort offered. Over. His head, her eyes met Thomas's, sharing wordless understanding of the magnitude of what they had learned. "We should move," Thomas said after allowing them a moment. "We've lost time, and I want to reach Whispering Pines before dark." They gathered their meager possessions and continued along the ridge above the falls, following a deer trail that wound through stands of ancient pine and oak. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Under different circumstances, Emma might have found the scenery peaceful, even beautiful. Now, every shadow concealed potential danger. Every unexpected sound triggered a surge of adrenaline. Joseph walked between them, occasionally reaching up to hold Emma's hand when the terrain grew difficult. The simple trust in the gesture touched her deeply. This child had lost everything, family, home, community, yet still found the courage to place his small hand in hers, believing she would keep him safe. As the afternoon waned, the forest began to change subtly. The pines grew taller, older, their massive trunks speaking of centuries of growth. The undergrowth thinned, revealing a carpet of needles that muffled their footsteps. Even the quality of light seemed different, softer somehow, filtered through branches that stirred even when no wind was apparent. Thomas slowed his pace, a new alertness in his bearing. "We're entering Grandmother Willow's territory," he said quietly. "From here, we follow her rules." Emma was about to ask what that meant when she noticed Joseph's expression, a mixture of awe and trepidation. Clearly, the boy understood something about this place that she did not. "Is she dangerous?" Emma asked cautiously. Thomas's lips quirked in what might almost have been a smile. "Only to those who mean harm. Grandmother Willow sees beyond appearances, beyond words. She judges the heart." The explanation was more mystical than practical, leaving Emma uncertain how to interpret it. But Joseph nodded solemnly, as though Thomas had stated a simple, obvious truth. They continued in silence, the forest growing darker as evening approached. Emma noticed strange markings on some of the larger pines, symbols carved into the bark, weathered with age but clearly deliberate. Thomas touched these reverently as they passed, murmuring words in Cherokee too quiet for Emma to catch. Just as twilight began to settle among the trees, they crested a small rise and looked down into a sheltered valley. Nestled among the towering pines were three structures, not typical Cherokee dwellings, but not settler cabins either. They seemed to grow from the landscape itself, built partially into hillsides, their roofs covered with living plants, smoke rising from stone chimneys, in thin, nearly invisible wisps. "Whispering Pines," Thomas said softly, "the last true sanctuary in these mountains." As they stood watching, a figure emerged from the largest structure, an elderly woman, her silver hair hanging in two long braids over a dress that blended traditional Cherokee elements with settler influences. She looked directly up at them, though Emma could not imagine how she had known they were there. "Grandmother Willow," Thomas confirmed, raising his hand in greeting. The woman returned the gesture, then motioned them down into the valley with a sweeping motion that somehow conveyed both welcome and urgency. "She's been expecting us," Thomas said, a hint of that same almost smile touching his lips. "How could she possibly—" Emma began. "Grandmother Willow knows many things," Joseph interrupted with the absolute certainty of childhood. "The trees tell her." Thomas didn't contradict this explanation, merely began leading them down toward the settlement. Emma followed, wondering what kind of woman commanded such reverence from both Thomas and Joseph, and how she could possibly help them stand against a conspiracy that reached from Riverton to Richmond. As they approached the valley floor, the old woman walked forward to meet them, her movements fluid despite her apparent age. Up close, Emma was struck by her eyes. dark, keen and filled with an intelligence that seemed to look through rather than at the people before her. "Thomas Rivers," the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You bring trouble to my doorstep." Despite the words, there was no censure in her tone, merely statement of fact. "Trouble found us first, grandmother," Thomas replied respectfully. "Hidden Springs is gone." The old woman's face revealed no surprise, only a deep sadness. "I know." The pine messengers brought word with the evening wind. Her gaze shifted to Joseph, softening perceptibly. One survivor, Adahi's son. Joseph stepped forward, head bowed in respect. "Grandmother." Willow placed a gnarled hand on his head in blessing or comfort, murmuring words in Cherokee that made the boy's shoulders straighten slightly. Then her penetrating gaze turned to Emma, assessing in a way that made her feel utterly transparent. "And who is this you bring among us, Thomas Rivers? A woman of the settlements, yet not entirely of them." Before Thomas could answer, Emma stepped forward, meeting the old woman's eyes directly. "My name is Emma Wilson. My family was killed by the same men who destroyed Hidden Springs. I seek sanctuary and justice." Grandmother Willow studied her for a long moment, then smiled, an expression that transformed her weathered face. Truth, spoken plainly. Good. She gestured toward the dwelling she had emerged from. "Come. Night approaches, and with it many dangers. We will speak inside, where only friendly spirits may listen." As they followed the elderly woman toward the strange, earth-integrated home, Emma felt a weight lift slightly from her shoulders. They had reached sanctuary, at least temporarily. What came next? Confronting Blackwood, exposing his conspiracy, seeking justice for Hidden Springs and her family, remained daunting challenges. But for this moment, walking beside Thomas with Joseph's small hand in hers, Emma allowed herself to feel something she had thought lost forever in the attack at Settlers Pass. Hope. Grandmother Willow's dwelling felt ancient despite its sturdy construction. The interior was a single large room divided by hanging woven panels, the walls a mixture of stacked stone and living tree trunks that appeared to grow directly through the structure. A central hearth glowed with banked coals, filling the space with warmth and the fragrant scent of cedar. "Sit," the elderly woman instructed, gesturing toward woven mats arranged around the fire pit. "Rest your bodies while we discuss what must be done." Emma settled onto a mat beside Joseph, grateful for the respite after their arduous journey. Thomas remained standing briefly, speaking quiet words to two men who had emerged from the other dwellings, Cherokee like himself, but fully. So, their expressions grave as they listened to news of Hidden Springs. When he finally joined them by the fire, Grandmother Willow had already placed a clay pot of fragrant tea on the coals to heat. She moved with the deliberate grace of age, but her hands remained steady as she distributed wooden cups. "Now," she said once they were all settled, "tell me everything. Leave nothing out, for the smallest detail may hold meaning." Between them, Thomas and Emma recounted the events of the past days, the attack on the Wilson wagon, Emma's survival, their discovery of the massacre at Hidden Springs, and Joseph's revelation about the territorial governor's involvement. The old woman listened without interruption, her sharp eyes moving between speakers, occasionally settling on Joseph with a tender concern that belied her stern demeanor. When they finished, she nodded slowly. "It is as I feared. The greed of men knows no bounds, not even those set by treaties and promises." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "This gold they seek is real, but not as abundant as they believe. The spirits placed it there as a test, I think. One that many men fail." Emma might once have dismissed such mystical pronouncements. Now, sitting in this strange dwelling that seemed to exist half in the natural world and half in some other realm, she found herself accepting the old woman's words without skepticism. "Can we stop Blackwood?" she asked instead. "He has the law behind him, or at least the appearance of it." Grandmother Willow's gaze sharpened. "You seek justice, not merely safety." "Yes," Emma said simply. "For my family, for Hidden Springs." The old woman nodded, approval evident in her expression. "The flame of vengeance burns in you, but it is tempered by something greater, the desire to protect others from suffering the same fate." She glanced at Thomas. "She reminds me of your mother." A shadow crossed Thomas's face, too quickly for Emma to interpret, before it vanished behind his usual composed expression. "High praise, grandmother. Truth, not praise." Willow turned, back to Emma. "To defeat this Blackwood, you need proof that even white men's courts cannot ignore. Joseph's testimony of what his father knew about the territorial governor's involvement is valuable, but not enough." "The papers his father mentioned," Thomas said. "The false accusations of Cherokee raids." Grandmother Willow nodded. "Such documents would be powerful evidence if they could be obtained." "They would be in Blackwood's office in Riverton," Emma realized. "Or his home." "A dangerous place for any of us," Thomas observed. "Especially now, with tensions so high." The old woman leaned forward, her eyes bright with intelligence despite her years. "Yet not impossible to access. I still have friends in Riverton, people who remember when Cherokee and settler lived in less hostile times. Among them is a woman who cleans the marshal's office twice weekly." Hope kindled in Emma's chest. "Could she find these papers?" "Perhaps. She cannot read, but she knows where Blackwood keeps his private correspondence." Grandmother Willow sipped her tea. "But even with such evidence, you would need a way to present it where it could not be simply destroyed or dismissed." "The circuit judge," Thomas said suddenly. "Judge Preston. He arrives in Riverton next week for the quarterly court sessions. He answers to Richmond, not to the local authorities." "Can he be trusted?" Emma asked. Thomas's expression was measured. "He has a reputation for fairness, even with cases involving natives. It's our best chance." Grandmother Willow nodded slowly. "So we need these papers, and we need to keep you alive until the judge arrives." She looked at Joseph. "And we need to protect this child who carries his father's knowledge." Emma reached out instinctively, placing her hand on Joseph's small shoulder. The boy leaned slightly into her touch, his solemn eyes fixed on the fire. "Joseph stays here," Thomas said, firmly. "Whispering Pines is remote enough that Blackwood's men won't find it easily." "And what of you two?" Grandmother Willow asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "We go to Riverton," Emma said, the decision crystallizing. In her mind, even as she spoke. "I can move more freely in town than Thomas. As a widow seeking information about my husband's business connections, I would raise few suspicions." Thomas frowned. "It's too dangerous." "Not if done correctly," Grandmother Willow interjected. "The woman has courage and intelligence. With the right preparation, she could succeed where you would certainly fail." Thomas Rivers. Emma felt a surge of gratitude toward the old woman for her confidence. "I can do this. I must do this." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "We'll need time to prepare. A different appearance for you, a believable story." 3 days, Grandmother Willow declared. "You will rest tomorrow, regain your strength, then we will make you into someone new." She turned her penetrating gaze on Thomas. "And you must prepare as well. Your role will be no less dangerous." As the conversation turned to practical details, Emma found her attention drawn to Joseph. The boy had remained silent throughout, absorbing the adults' discussion with the preternatural stillness that seemed characteristic of him. Meeting his eyes now, she saw understanding beyond his years. "You will come back?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of Thomas and Grandmother Willow's planning. Emma squeezed his shoulder gently. "Yes, I promise." The certainty in her own voice surprised her. 4 days ago, she had been a proper Charleston lady, concerned with social calls and embroidery. Now she was preparing to enter a dangerous town, under false pretenses to gather evidence against a murderous marshal. The transformation should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like stepping into a role she had somehow been preparing for all her life. Later, after a simple but nourishing meal, Emma was shown to a small alcove partitioned from the main room. A pallet of soft furs provided more comfort than she had experienced since the attack. As she settled in for the night, Thomas appeared briefly at the entrance to her space. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice low to avoid disturbing the others. Emma sat up, meeting his gaze directly. "Would you ask that question of a man?" The blunt challenge surprised them both. After a moment, Thomas's lips curved in the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "No," he admitted. "I wouldn't." He hesitated, then added, "My mother would have liked you. She had the same way of cutting to the heart of things." "You've mentioned her twice now," Emma observed, "but never your father." Thomas's expression shuttered slightly. "My father was a white trader who left when I was young. My mother raised me in the old ways, though she herself had adapted to live between worlds." His voice softened with memory. "She died during a fever outbreak 5 winters ago. The settlement doctor refused to treat Cherokee." The simple statement contained volumes of pain and injustice. Emma found herself at a loss for an adequate response. "I'm sorry," seemed woefully insufficient. "We all carry our grief," Thomas said, as if sensing her discomfort. "It shapes us, but need not define us." He straightened, his posture resuming its customary alertness. "Rest now. Tomorrow begins your transformation." The promised transformation proved more comprehensive than Emma had anticipated. Under Grandmother Willow's direction, her appearance altered dramatically over the following days. Her hair, once arranged in fashionable coils, was cut shorter and styled simply, then darkened with a mixture of walnut hull and indigo that Grandmother Willow assured her would wash out eventually. Her skin was subtly weathered with herb-infused oils to suggest a life lived outdoors rather than protected by parasols and veils. Most significantly, her entire demeanor changed through careful coaching. She practiced walking with the confident stride of a frontier woman rather than the measured steps of a Charleston lady. Her speech patterns shifted, dropping certain refinements while retaining enough polish to suggest education without excessive privilege. "You are now Rebecca Gray," Grandmother Willow declared on the 3rd day, surveying her handiwork with satisfaction. "Recently widowed, traveled from Tennessee to settle your late husband's affairs with business partners in Riverton." Emma, now Rebecca, studied her reflection in the polished metal mirror the old woman held. A stranger looked back at her, familiar in feature but transformed in essence. "Will it be enough?" "Combined with this," Thomas said, producing a small leather folio containing carefully forged documents establishing her fictional identity. Letters of introduction, a marriage certificate, even a deed to non-existent property in Tennessee. "Where did you get these?" Emma asked, astonished by their professional appearance. A rare smile touched Thomas's lips. "Grandmother has many talents and many friends with specialized skills." The elderly woman sniffed dismissively, though Emma detected a hint of pride beneath the show of modesty. "When you are hunted for generations, you learn many ways to survive. Paperwork is a white man's magic, but not one beyond our understanding." Their own preparation had been equally thorough. Thomas would not enter Riverton itself, but would establish a camp in the foothills just outside town, posing as a solitary hunter, close enough to provide assistance if needed, but not so visible as to attract unwanted attention. The plan itself was elegant in its simplicity. Emma, as Rebecca Gray, would take a room at Riverton's only boarding house, make contact with Grandmother Willow's friend, who cleaned the marshal's office, and locate the incriminating documents. Once secured, she would bring them to Judge Preston upon his arrival for the quarterly court sessions, then slip away in the inevitable chaos that would follow. "What about Joseph?" Emma asked as their departure approached. "He should come with us to testify about his father's knowledge." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. If something goes wrong, Blackwood would not hesitate to eliminate such a witness." He softened at Emma's obvious concern for the boy. "He'll be safe here with Grandmother. If we succeed in obtaining the documents, we can send for him when the judge arrives." Though reluctant, Emma accepted the wisdom of this decision. In just a few days, she had grown attached to the solemn child who bore his grief with such dignity. The night before her departure, she found Joseph sitting alone outside, gazing at the stars scattered across the mountain sky. "My father said, 'The stars are the campfires of those who walked before us,'" he said as she joined him, "that they watch over us from the sky world." Emma settled beside him, allowing the comfortable silence to stretch between them. "Do you believe that?" Joseph considered the question with characteristic seriousness. "I believe they are still here somehow, that they see us." He turned to her, his young face solemn in the starlight. "Will you come back for me? After you catch the bad marshal?" "Yes," Emma said without hesitation. "I promised, remember?" The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Grandmother says promises made under stars cannot be broken." "Then I promise again," Emma said, pointing to a particularly bright star. "By that one, I will come back for you, Joseph." When dawn broke the following morning, the time for farewells arrived. Grandmother Willow pressed a small leather pouch into Emma's hand. "For courage and clear sight," she explained, while the other residents of Whispering Pines offered quiet words of support and blessing. Joseph stood apart, maintaining the stoic dignity that seemed far beyond his years. When Emma knelt before him, he surprised her by initiating an embrace, his small arms tight around her neck. "Be safe," he whispered, like Fox, silent and clever. Emma returned the embrace, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "I will. Take care of Grandmother while I'm gone." Thomas watched this exchange with an unreadable expression. When Emma approached him, ready to depart, he simply nodded once. "We should reach the outskirts of Riverton by nightfall if we maintain a good pace." The journey passed largely in silence, both of them conserving energy and focus for the challenges ahead. By sunset, the forest began to thin, giving way to scattered clearings and eventually to the first outlying farms that marked the approach to Riverton. Thomas led them to a secluded spot with a view of the town below, a collection of wooden buildings arranged around a central square, smoke rising from chimneys against the darkening sky. It looked deceptively peaceful from this distance. "This is where we separate," he said, indicating a fallen log where they could rest briefly. "The main road is just beyond that ridge. Follow it into town. The boarding house is on the east side of the square. Williams is lodging. Martha Williams is a fair woman, unlikely to ask too many questions of a widow." Emma nodded, mentally reviewing the details of her fabricated identity once more. "And your friend, Grandmother's friend, who cleans the marshal's office?" "Eliza Jenkins. She'll find you tomorrow. I've already sent word through channels Grandmother arranged." Thomas hesitated, then added, "If anything seems wrong, anything at all, don't hesitate. Leave immediately and return here." "I won't take unnecessary risks," Emma promised. She studied his face in the fading light, struck by how familiar it had become in just a few days. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." He nodded once. Acceptance without sentimentality. "We have 3 days until Judge Preston arrives. If you haven't returned by then." The implication hung in the air between them. If she didn't return, it likely meant capture, or worse. "I'll return," Emma said with more confidence than she truly felt. "With the evidence we need." Thomas reached into his pack and withdrew a small knife in a leather sheath. Not his hunting blade, but a smaller weapon that could be concealed more easily. "Keep this with you, always." Emma accepted it, tucking it into a hidden pocket. "Grandmother." Willow had sewn into her modified dress. "For emergencies only," she agreed. "Go now while there's still enough light to see the road." Thomas's expression remained composed, but something in his eyes suggested concern he wouldn't voice. "Remember your story. Remember who Rebecca Gray is." Emma nodded, straightening her shoulders and consciously shifting her posture to embody her new identity. "Rebecca Gray," she repeated, "widow from Tennessee, looking to settle her husband's affairs." With a final nod of farewell, she turned and began making her way toward the ridge Thomas had indicated. At the crest, she looked back once to see him still watching, a solitary figure against the darkening forest. Then she descended toward Riverton, each step carrying her closer to the man who had destroyed her family. As the first buildings came into view, Emma drew a deep breath and fully embraced her new identity. Rebecca Gray squared her shoulders, adjusted the modest bonnet covering her darkened hair, and walked purposefully into town. Whatever awaited her there, danger, justice, or some combination of both, she would face it as she had faced everything. Since that terrible day on Settlers Pass, one step at a time, with courage born of necessity and determination forged in loss. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.